My guest at this time is Andrew C. McCarthy. Andy served as Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. He is now a contributing editor and columnist at National Review Online. He is also a Fox News Channel contributor. We wanted to get his thoughts after a marathon day of questioning for former Special Counsel Robert Mueller before the House Judiciary and Intelligence Committees. And Andy, thanks so much for being with us.
Greg, it's my pleasure.
Well, the goals of the two parties seemed pretty clear from the get-go, and we'll take them one at a time here. Democrats clearly wanted to make the argument that Bob Mueller and his team absolutely would have indicted President Trump, except for the fact that Trump is the sitting president and the Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department does not sanction such a thing. Here's Florida Congressman Ted Deutsch.
Director Mueller, you found evidence, as you lay out in your report, that the president wanted to fire you because you were investigating him for obstruction of justice. Isn't that correct?
That's what it says in the report, yes. And I stand behind the report.
Director Mueller, that shouldn't happen in America. No president should be able to escape investigation by abusing his power. But that's what you testified to in your report. The president ordered you fired. The White House counsel knew it was wrong. The president knew it was wrong. In your report, it says there's also evidence the president knew he should not have made those calls to McGahn. But the president did it anyway.
So Bob Mueller did say what the Democrats wanted him to say in terms of that the result was not no collusion, no obstruction, like Trump says, total exoneration, that sort of thing. And we know Volume 2 of the Mueller report is not kind to Trump, to say the least. But did the Democrats get what they needed or wanted from Bob Mueller in total today?
No, I think today is really a disaster for the Democrats. You know, what this was teed up as, Greg, was Nadler at the beginning of the day pointed out that in Mueller's press statement on May 29th, he said that the Constitution does not use the criminal justice system to deal with presidential misconduct. It has another process that it outlines. And clearly that was an allusion to the Constitution's giving Congress the power to impeach in Article 1. And Nadler made a point of playing off that in his opening statement. He said that process that Mueller was talking about begins here. That's the work of this committee. So this was teed up clearly as he was their star witness on impeachment, and it turned out that he knew very little about his investigation, that he was willing to say very little about his investigation. He would not, on the substance of what you're talking about, he didn't give the Democrats what they wanted, which was basically a clear-cut statement that if it hadn't been for the Office of Legal Counsel guidance, he would have indicted the president, or at least recommended the indictment of the president. He came close to doing that at one point with Congressman Liu at a point in time where it was clear that Mueller had gotten kind of tired and fatigued and punchy, and he agreed with Liu's leading questions that if it hadn't been for the guidance, he would have indicted. But he realized he had made a mistake, so the first thing he did when he came back this afternoon was clean that up. He said, I misspoke when I gave that testimony. I go with what's in the report. And, of course, the report says that they never even got to the point of considering whether to indict him. They interpreted the Office of Legal Counsel guidance to say not only that they couldn't indict a sitting president, but they couldn't consider indicting him. So he didn't give the Democrats what they wanted. Substantively, he didn't give the Republicans what they wanted, in the sense the Republicans wanted to probe all kinds of investigative decision-making and wanted to ask lots of questions about the genesis of the investigation and the Steele dossier, and Joseph Mifsud, the Maltese professor at the bottom of the Papadopoulos escapade. Those things all came up, and Mueller basically wouldn't give them anything. He basically said, no, anything about the investigation. I'm here to testify about the investigation. I can't answer questions about the investigation. So it was very frustrating to see them go around and around on that. But, just the taking a step back and looking at the overall effect of the day, what you came away with was that Mueller could not conceivably have been the person who ran this investigation. He was clearly staff-driven. He didn't know very much about either the investigation or the report. He didn't even want to discuss who had written a letter that he wrote on March 27th to the Justice Department. He acted like that was kind of a big state secret. It was clear that he had, it was obvious he had gotten help on it. But the point is, all of President Trump's emphasis all these months on the activist Democrats who overwhelmingly make up the staff that Mueller chose for this investigation, a lot of people poo-pooed that because they said, well, Mueller's a Republican and he's there and he's running the show. It was very clear today he was not running the show.
We're talking with Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. And talk a little bit more, Andy, about Mueller's performance today. A lot of it was just him referring to the report and then lawmakers reading from the report and him saying, well, if that's in the report, then I stand by that. That's what I'm here to do, is stand by the report. A lot of times he asked for questions to be repeated. You pointed out before we came on air here about him scrambling and fumbling to just find the word conspiracy as opposed to collusion. Yeah. And he just didn't seem as sharp as most folks expected. What's the impact of that legally and politically?
Well, I think it's first of all, viscerally, Greg, it's very sad because this probably is what Mueller may end up being. I hope this isn't the case, but it may be what he ends up being known best for. It may be his last big appearance on the public stage, and he really has had an iconic career in law enforcement. So to see him flail away like that today was kind of sad. Obviously, the importance to the country is not his reputation. It's the impact of this investigation, the genesis of it, the conduct of it, and what it held. And because the investigation's been so identified with him, and he clearly came across today in 5 or 6 hours of testimony as somebody who was not up to doing this investigation, that's obviously going to raise big questions about the content of the report and who actually was driving this train. And, it's not just that he had a grope for the word conspiracy. Now, any of us, believe me, I've done enough speaking where, there was some obvious word that I couldn't come up with. And it's always a kind of an embarrassing feeling when, there's something you feel like you should know at the tip of your tongue and you can't come up with the word. But that wasn't a one-off. This is the kind of thing that happened all day long. And I thought one of the real low points was, he had one Democratic congressman, I can't remember which one it was, but he was trying to paint a heroic portrait of Mueller, which is not hard to do. If you go back into his background, there's a lot of heroism in it. But instead of spoon-feeding him the information, he asked him, do you remember which president it was who named you the United States Attorney of Massachusetts? And he couldn't remember that it was President Reagan, which is a pretty big thing not to be able to come up with. He actually guessed the wrong president. Now, you could say that, well, it's because he's had so many important positions in the government, he can be forgiven for flubbing that. That's not really in the kind of career we're talking about. And people who do what I used to do for a living, that's not the kind of thing you ever in your life forget, yet he couldn't come up with it. And, it was clear that he wasn't like sort of firing on all cylinders. He wasn't trying to mislead anyone. He just had a hard time.
You mentioned the Republicans and what they tried to do, and Mueller even said in his opening statement, I can't talk about anything outside the scope, and specifically mentioned the genesis of the FBI investigation or anything related to the Steele dossier. That certainly didn't stop Republicans from trying. You mentioned the questions about Joseph Mifsud. Jim Jordan was all over that. Steve Chabot asked a bunch of questions on the Judiciary Committee about a lot of different things, knowing full well that Mueller's answer would be that that's outside his purview. Did the Republicans score any narrative points today, or is this just now at the point where we're kind of at a stalemate and anybody who's still paying attention has already made up their mind?
Yeah, I think they did score some points for those who are still keeping score. It'll be overwhelmed in terms of its impact by just the focus that will be on how poorly Mueller did. But there are a lot of questions about the investigation, in particular the question of why Mueller did not indict Joseph Mifsud, the Maltese professor, is one of the enduring curiosities and mysteries of this investigation. Mifsud is a critically important individual, not that that many people probably even remember his name at this point, but he is the one who supposedly had the Russian connections and told George Papadopoulos that the Russians had Hillary Clinton emails, which Papadopoulos in some form communicated to this Australian diplomat who passed it along to the State Department, who passed it along to the FBI, which is supposedly the cause of the opening of the FBI's investigation in July of 2016. So this is a very important piece of information. The FBI actually interviewed Mifsud, and he denied telling Papadopoulos the information about the Clinton emails. And if there's one thing we know about from Mueller's investigation, it's that he and his staff knew how to indict people for false statements if they lied to FBI agents. And yet Mifsud, who is a central figure here, does not get charged with false statements. And while Director Comey, I thought quite surprisingly, came out in this Washington Post op-ed he did a few weeks back and flatly called this guy a Russian agent, the fact of the matter is, from what we can detect, he seems to have a lot closer ties to Western intelligence services than to the Russians. So I think it's all very curious, and that's something that'll clearly be pursued, I think, after this hearing today.
Andy, last topic, and it's one we've closed on a few different times in talking about the Mueller investigation, but it still kind of baffles me, and I don't know if it baffles you as well, but other than Zoe Lofgren, the congresswoman from California, the Democrat today, I don't recall a single member, and maybe I'm wrong because I didn't see all of it, actually spend a lot of time talking about the ongoing threat that Russia and perhaps other actors present to our elections and our campaigning, which, as Mueller stressed in the report and in his statement a couple months back, is the thing he really wants everybody to take away from this. And but when there's political points to be scored in one way or another, it seems to get left on the side of the road.
Yeah, well, to be fair to him and fair to Congress, I think that there was a lot more of that, Greg, in the second hearing today than there was in the first. And the way they kind of divvied this up, the first hearing before the Judiciary Committee was going to deal with obstruction of justice, and the second hearing before the Intelligence Committee was going to deal with collusion with Russia. So there was a lot more addressing of the threat that Russia poses to the election, or poses not just what it did in the 2016 election, but the current and future threat, not only, as Mueller pointed out, not just from Russia, but from other potential adversary powers, too. So they didn't leave that completely unaddressed. My beef with this throughout has been, as somebody who, never thought of Russia as a strategic partner of the United States or any of the nonsense that we've been told since the Soviet Union fell. I've always thought of them as a kind of a hostile power, not a power we're at war with, but certainly a geopolitical foe, as Mitt Romney famously put it in 2012. I always thought that Russia was a threat. I think a lot of us always thought that Russia was a threat, and it was, progressives and Democrats and a lot of Republicans too, who were telling us that Russia was just fine and it was getting to be a normal country and it was one that we could comfortably deal with and have commerce with and the like. Russia's been interfering in our elections virtually since the Bolshevik Revolution, and I don't doubt that they remain a threat to do that and will remain a threat to do that in the future. I just think it probably should have gotten attention before it was perceived as being more helpful to Republicans than Democrats.
And I lied. One last question. What's the next big thing here? Is it Durham and his probe? Is it the Inspector General Horowitz? What's the next thing we're all waiting for?
Well, I do think that it'll be the Inspector General's report, which we're now hearing we probably won't see until September, and that's because they've got more information that they've had to work through. So that's interesting. But overall, Greg, I think the focus shifts both legally and politically from, impeachment and that bundle of issues to the investigation of the investigators, which is what the Barr-Durham investigation is about. It's what Inspector General Horowitz's investigation is about. And I do think this hearing today with Mueller is a good launch point for those who are interested in investigating the investigators, because, again, the big takeaway today is there's no way that Mueller was running this investigation in anything close to a hands-on way. And again, it goes to the question of, did Trump get the same quality of justice? This is really more of a rhetorical question at this point than a real one. Did Trump get the same quality of justice that, say, Hillary Clinton got in the emails investigation?
A good question to leave the audience hanging on. Andy, as always, good to have you with us. Thanks for your insights.
Thanks so much, Greg.
Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, now a contributing editor and columnist at National Review Online, now also a Fox News Channel contributor. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.